Hello everyone, and welcome to week 3 of Poll 361. In today's lecture, we will learn how to identify different types of variables, define concepts, and discuss what the primary characteristics of good hypotheses are. This lecture is instrumental in helping you identify your own hypotheses, which you will eventually learn how to test using various statistical methods. Before we begin, I want to go over a brief recap of what we've been working on so far and where we're headed. So up until this point, you've been working on developing your research question, making sure that that statement at least includes a unit of analysis, the level or entity by which your observations will be made, and a primary dependent variable of interest. Eventually, I'd like your research questions to incorporate at least one primary independent variable, but that's what today's lecture is all about, so it's totally fine if you're not at that point yet. We've also been working on ensuring that you have available data for your research topics. As we'll discuss today, it's imperative that data exist for your research topic in order to write a research paper for this course. So if you haven't yet found the perfect data set, we will continue to work on that in Thursday's class. Again, with this week's lecture, I want to get you thinking about the independent variables that you're going to include in your research paper. These are the things that explain what you're really interested in studying. So the independent variables explain the dependent variable. And lastly, don't forget that your research topics are due in Canvas this Thursday at 12:40 p.m. That's when our class normally starts. So before class, the evening before, just make sure that you submit a written statement of your research question into Canvas. This counts as part of your research milestone deadlines and ultimately is a component of your total research paper grade. So just make sure that you get those turned in on time. Okay, today I have 3 separate videos prepared for you. Since we cover some, pretty new topics that I don't expect many of you to have much familiarity with, these lectures are going to be about an hour each week. And I know that nobody wants to sit through 1 hour long lecture video. So what I've done for you to help ease that up on your schedule a little bit is I've created 3 separate video lectures. So you can watch those kind of throughout the day at your own leisure. You don't have to document where you paused and where to pick back up again. So I really hope that you find this format helpful. So part 1 of today's video lecture, we're going to talk about different types of variables and how to propose explanations and articulating hypotheses. That's about 16 minutes. That's the video you're watching now. The part 2 video lecture is the longest, and that's where we cover a lot of really critical material. So clarifying the relationship between variables, different types of independent variables, and the 6 characteristics of good hypotheses. That's the big one. I think that one's about 50 minutes long. And then the third part of the lecture, that's all about common errors made in statistical analyses and making sure that you don't fall victim to those. So we'll talk about ecological inferences, which is what you'll strive to do, and ecological fallacies, which you will want to avoid at all costs. And then we'll wrap up the part 3 lecture with an introduction to how we define and measure concepts. So I think that last one is about 25 minutes. So I really hope that you appreciate the format here. And that makes your schedules a lot easier. As always, do not forget or hesitate to write down any questions that you have on the material. As we go on week to week to week, the material's just going to get, a little bit more advanced. It might become a little bit more complicated. And so you just don't forget to communicate with me, and any questions you have in the lecture, just post those in the optional discussion board each week. There's no such thing as a stupid question. And if you have really detailed questions that you think can't be sufficiently answered in a discussion board class or a discussion board post, just bring those questions to class and we will discuss them thoroughly when we're meeting together in person. So I hope you enjoyed today's lecture. And with all that being said, let's go ahead and get started. Like I said in the beginning, this lecture is all about how to propose explanations for the relationship that you want to investigate in your research question. These explanations often make predictions about the expected relationship between two variables. This specifically is known as a hypothesis, and we'll discuss the appropriate way to formulate hypotheses in this lecture. Lastly, we're also going to go over a brief introduction on how to define and measure key variables and concepts within hypotheses. So let's start with an example. Say we wanted to investigate the political response to the COVID pandemic in each state. So our research question might be something like, why did some states enforce stricter policies than others in response to the COVID-19 pandemic? And when you're trying to offer an answer for your research question, there are three major things that you should be thinking about. Now let's start with the framework of proposing an explanation. So first, what does the literature say? Especially if this is a topic that you have no familiarity with, let's start with the literature and see what other studies have done and other findings and conclusions that those studies have came to. If we want to understand how states may differ in their response to a public health crisis, well, let's look at the research that has investigated similar public health crises. Once we understand the connections other authors have made, it'll be easier for us to understand what's going on in our unique case. So we could really just do a quick Google Scholar search and read through some of these articles and get an idea of how states generally respond to public health crises. The second thing that we need to do is identify relationships in the existing literature. This will give us a really good idea of the types of independent variables we want to include in our study. So from reading the literature review, you'll start to have a better understanding about different relationships scholars have proposed for a given phenomenon. For example, let's read through the second article that came up in our Google search in a little bit more detail to see if reading about the public response to the opioid crisis can give us any insight into how states might respond to COVID. And in fact, right here on page 2 of that second search result, we find this really helpful table that the authors have made that walk us through how to measure different strategies and responses to public health crises. So what we do as social scientists is we can take this framework and we can apply it to our specific case. And remember, we refer to this as deductive reasoning, beginning with a broad principle and applying it to a specific observation. The final step in formulating your explanations for your research paper is to start thinking like a social scientist. Put your mind in what I call the political brain when you're trying to explain your research question. What have you learned so far about political decision making in your courses here at UWL? Things that might explain why some states have a very strict response to COVID and why others don't. What do you already know about political science that can help you explain your research topic? So now that you understand the basic framework for proposing explanations, let's focus on how we execute our explanations. So when proposing explanations for your research question, there are 3 general approaches that you can take. You might exclusively rely on one of these approaches, or you might use a mix of all 3. It's completely up to you. It all depends on your specific research question. So the first thing you can do is you can propose explanations based upon a cause and effect paradigm. Second, you can try to explain patterns of behavior. Or third, you can explain why you're updating a certain theory or approach. So let's look at all of these in a little bit more detail. Let's begin by attempting to explain our research question on COVID with a cause and effect approach. So why do some states enforce stricter policies than others in response to the COVID-19 pandemic? Well, this approach generally requires a broader understanding of the problem before you begin the research process. If you're very familiar with topics in public health, you might already know that populations with more at-risk members require greater protections. In other words, if a disease breaks out in a retirement community where most individuals are immunocompromised, that population is obviously way more at risk than a disease breaking out in a community of relatively healthy people in their 30s. So we would expect stricter action from a state if their population was more at risk. Additionally, if a disease broke out in a rural area, there might be less concern about acting quickly, considering how remote and isolated the area is. Consider this opposed to a disease breaking out in a major metropolitan area with very high population density. And if one person gets sick, the probability that others is much, much higher, and it'll spread much, much faster. So we might expect states to behave differently based upon the very nuanced environmental characteristics. So we know that COVID generally presents more risks to individuals who are immunocompromised. Thus, here's our, beginning to propose our explanation. State governments with more at-risk populations, we might expect them to enforce stricter policies to reduce COVID infections. So thus, we have offered one potential explanation as to why some states vary in their responses to handling COVID. Now, let's use inductive reasoning to formulate a potential explanation. So as you notice, the previous example was all deductive, going from broad to specific. So now let's turn that around and go from specific to broad. And just to reiterate that point a little bit further, inductive reasoning means we are beginning with a specific observation and we are trying to generalize that observation to explain all cases, or at least most cases. So let's say that you're really plugged into the news and you've been following this topic for a long time, and a specific observation that you have made is the constant discussion on mask mandates. We could certainly consider a state mandate that requires mask wearing to be a political response to COVID, right? And imagine that one day you see this chart on the news or in an article that shows you which states have mask mandates and those that do not. And you start asking yourself, why? Why do some states require masks and others haven't? And then it hits you. You realize in all of these purple states, the ones without mask mandates, all of them have something in common. They all have Republican governors. So you start thinking to yourself, well, mask mandates are a specific policy response to COVID. Every state that does not have a mask mandate has a Republican governor, and perhaps party control of the state government influences the policy response to COVID. And now, we've just formulated our second potential explanation to our research question utilizing inductive reasoning. Finally, updating well-established theories to a new topic is another way that you can yield a potential explanation for your research question. And again, this approach is going to require that you have a very solid and firm understanding of the literature and pre-existing theories out there. And I don't really think that this approach is super applicable to many people who are, just writing their first research paper. But if you continue your academic careers beyond this course, certainly if you're interested in graduate school or law school, developing a specific research agenda where you're very familiar with the topic, you'll absolutely use this type of method in the future. So I just want to go ahead and give you an example of how a theory building explanation might look. So let's return to that article on the opioid crisis from the beginning of the lecture. So earlier, when we were examining the literature to get a good idea of how states might respond to a public health crisis, we came across this article that provided a really solid theoretical framework on how states responded to the opioid epidemic. And now, if we wanted to advance upon this theory, we could take each of these items here and see how well they explain the response to COVID in each state. We could read press releases or news articles in every state to determine how well the governor communicated with the government and the people on his or her response to COVID. We could examine the extent to which each state government formed partnerships with other organizations or members in the community to reduce the spread of COVID-19. So this article in particular has about like 5 different elements on key strategies that I'm not going to go into on much more detail. But the point is that we are essentially borrowing a very complex theoretical explanation from a closely related topic, and we test the extent to which it also explains state policy responses to COVID. And if the framework does a really good job at also explaining COVID, then we consider this to be a very strong theoretical tool. So theories, in essence, all they do is they help us explain the world around us. And if a theory can help explain why certain things happen in a lot of different cases, then we consider that to be a really strong theory. And again, this is more of an advanced method of explaining your research topic, but nonetheless, I think it's still worth discussing in this introductory lecture. And don't worry if some of these are still a little complicated. We will run through more examples on how to offer explanations to research questions on Thursday during our in-person meeting. All right, everyone, that is the end of part 1. When you are ready to proceed with the rest of the course content, go ahead and click next and watch the video on differences between independent variables and dependent variables and the criteria of good hypotheses.